As the ruins of Toulon still smouldered, Brigadier General Napoleon Bonaparte made his way west to Marseille. His reputation preceded him. Here was the architect of victory at Toulon, a 2-star general at 24, a man of ambition and the talent to back it up. Napoleon enjoyed friends in high places, representatives on mission like Augustin Robespierre and Paul Borat, friend and countryman Antonio Salicetti, Generals Cervoni and Dugommier, impressed by Napoleon's conduct at Toulon, and then there were newfound friends, Andoche Junot and André Massena. Napoleon's name and exploits were even known to Maximilien Robespierre himself. And yet, despite early success, Napoleon's position was perilously compromised. Martial success could only carry him so far without political support. His role in the siege of Toulon had been undersold in French propaganda in favour of lionising Dugommier and Salicetti. And as a card-carrying Jacobin, Napoleon was bound at the hip to the vagaries of Paris politics. Moreover, the word of the representatives on mission echoed far and wide. Borat and Salicetti might help, but they could just as easily hinder. There was some delay in deciding what to do with Napoleon after Toulon. He had been field promoted, sure, but it took months for this information to reach the Committee of Public Safety in Paris, and once mulled over, filter back down south. Thus, Napoleon spent the first few months of 1794 in administrative limbo, awaiting word of his next assignment. It was with these worries on his shoulders that Napoleon arrived in Marseille. Once there, he surveyed the city's defences, its forts, coastal batteries and redoubts. With this information, Napoleon drew up maps and recommended numerous alterations or improvements. Experience had shown French ports to be vulnerable, so his recommendations were taken seriously, but often ignored. On February 12th, Napoleon observed wryly, "They have spent a good sum of money on the coast, and made a hash of it." To aid Napoleon in these endeavours were the members of his general staff. We've met two already. Auguste Marmont had acquitted himself well at Toulon, and Andoche Junot served not only as Napoleon's secretary, but was also a close friend. The two got along famously. By contrast, Chef de Battalion Berlier and Napoleon were not on good terms. Napoleon was rapid fire with his orders. Berlier could scarcely keep pace. As per instructions, Napoleon continued to survey the defences along the French Riviera, from the Rhône to the Var, as he put it, revisiting Toulon in the process. For 2 months, this busy work kept Napoleon occupied, if underutilised. The wheels of bureaucracy finally turned over on February 7th, when Napoleon's rank was confirmed. The paperwork asked Napoleon to confirm whether or not he was a nobleman. Shrewdly, he said he was not. Duly promoted, Napoleon received his next assignment, the post of Commander of Artillery to the Army of Italy. Despite appearances, this appointment was something of a lateral promotion. The Army of Italy was by far the most neglected of France's field armies, and in the kind of stagnant mountain warfare of the Italian campaign thus far, there was little chance for glory. There was also the problem of the army commander, General Pierre Dumberion. It wasn't long after arriving in Nice that Napoleon met Dumberion, and he was less than impressed. By all accounts, Dumberion was a completely capable, if unremarkable commander. His real deficit was a lack of initiative, born of survival instinct. French generals had a nasty habit of winding up dead for failures in the field. Dumberion's solution was to observe the will of the representatives on mission in all things. He even went so far as to ask for their advice on what to do, and simply followed through on that plan, regardless of its efficacy. But there was a silver lining to Dumberion's deference, because it was Augustin and Salicetti who were currently attached to the army. Both men trusted Napoleon and could vouch for his abilities. It wasn't long before these two were taking strategic advice from Napoleon and passing it along to Dumberion as orders. So in effect, Napoleon was indirectly in strategic command of the Army of Italy. And the strategic outlook appeared grim. By 1794, France was blockaded and exhausted, increasingly afflicted by famine and economic deprivation. The French economy groaned under the needs imposed by an army of 1 million men and a population of 30 million that still needed to be fed and make a living. All the while, French ports were blockaded, so the import-export trade economy was annihilated. These economic woes had contributed heavily to the outbreak of the Federalist revolts, and the defection of French ports in Brittany, Normandy, and as we've seen, Provence. The only real hope public safety had to stabilise a collapsing economy was to return to the strategic offensive. Offensives of 1792 and 1793 had either been dismal failures or temporary successes. What public safety wanted was permanent occupation of foreign territories, whose taxes would be raised and treasures looted to maintain the army. In exchange, these territories would be liberated, either annexed into the Republic directly or formed into new sister republics. Liberated peoples of occupied territories would be treated well, albeit economically exploited, in a policy dubbed War on the Castles, Peace to the Villages. Napoleon's own army of Italy fit into this larger strategic picture as a force poised to reopen trade with neutral third parties. In the south, the near-term objective set by public safety was to reconnect the economy to Genoese imports and them to French exports. The Republic of Genoa was a neutral state, whose imports had supplied the French with grain and provided an outlet for their exports, until the British had come along and cut off trade. The Royal Navy ruled the waves, while the Sardinia-Piedmont territory of Aemilia prevented overland trade. The French Republic had tried diplomatic strong-arming and strategic maneuvers to try and restore lines of trade with Genoa, but to no avail. After the outbreak of war in early 1792, the French had advanced and captured numerous outlying Savoyard towns and cities. The most integral of these conquests was Nice, taken in November after the Savoyard commander, Charles-François Toulon, retreated in disgrace. The Sardinia-Piemontese were reeling from these losses. So for 1793, the French fancied their chances with a follow-up offensive across the Alps. From their new base in Nice, General Louis Gontaut was in command. After Gontaut achieved modest successes, Toulon rallied along the strong fortress at Saogio. Despite his best efforts, Gontaut was sent packing on June 12th after the Battle of Saogio. An elderly Austrian commander, Feldzeugmeister Nikolaus de Vin, then assumed command of coalition forces, launching a haphazard offensive in September. Francois Kellerman, of Vimy fame, repulsed these attacks. However, it was around this time that the Federalist revolts erupted. The French retreated to bases behind the Alps, while the coalition slowly advanced. Winter set in, forcing both sides to wait for 1794's spring thaw. With his customary confidence, Napoleon set about the daunting task of planning this offensive. Public safety was deeply concerned by recent Spanish incursions across the Eastern Pyrenees, something which Napoleon had referenced in his Super de Beaucaire. Now he changed his tune and proposed a defensive posture in the Pyrenees, but an offensive in Italy. These plans he drew up alongside Junot. Junot, after translating Napoleon's barely legible scrawl, referred these plans to Augustin Robespierre, who himself transmitted them to public safety. The committee gave the green light, and the offensive was tentatively set for April. The Army of Italy confronted a formidable coalition force of some 45,000 men. The Army of Sardinia-Piedmont was sitting pretty in strong entrenchments that ran the length of the Alps, all the way down to the coastline at Aemilia. Their largest concentration was still at the fortress of Saogio, where the Sardinia-Piemontese made their base. Overall coalition command was in the hands of de Vins, as we've seen, a greybeard with plenty of experience, but little talent. He brought with him an Austrian division, which was held in reserve, as well as subordinate generals Colimanchi and de Argentor. Fatefully, relations between the Austrians and Sardinia-Piemontese were strained. It was the intention of the reformist king Victor Amadeus III and de Vins to liberate the lost city of Nice. However, de Vins counselled caution, while Savoy commander Toulon, though the victor of Saogio, wanted to avenge his humiliating retreat of 1792 by rapidly reconquering Nice. Nice provided an excellent base of operations for the French, and it was from Nice that Napoleon intended to launch the offensive. He took the lessons of 92 and 93 to heart, tempering them with his own experience at Ajaccio and Toulon. Domberion would attack along the coast and take Aemilia, and to cover him, Massena would detach a division of around 5,000 men and launch a feint through the alpine valleys of Nervia and Roya towards Saogio. Troops were pre-positioned for the offensive on April 2nd. The offensive commenced on April 16th. Domberion took 20,000 men and advanced along the coast, brushing aside light resistance. Massena, meanwhile, led 2 brigades over the border in a lightning attack that ignored Sardinia-Piedmont defences at Tarnado to fully occupy Ormea. De Vins was caught completely off guard and sluggish in his response. He ordered a withdrawal from Saogio, having overestimated the scale of the French feint. Massena saw an opportunity and wasted no time. He raced towards Saogio and blocked the escape route. Trapped between Domberion to the south and Massena to the north, a chunk of the Sardinia-Piedmont army surrendered to Domberion at the Second Saogio. Before long, the western approaches to Genoa at Albania and Loano surrendered to the French. By May, the French had built up their defences and controlled the passes across the Alps. Napoleon's offensive had been a stunning success. Military historian David Chandler identifies 3 key reasons for Napoleon's success. First, a deep internalization of the tenets of mountain warfare, skills that will serve Napoleon extremely well in the years to come. Second, the division of his forces in petits paquets, or smaller parts. Dispersing forces like this was a break from conventional military wisdom, which held that an army dispersed was an army likely to be defeated in detail. Napoleon's innovation was to give these packets leeway to conduct independent operations, but always in close proximity to other packets and the main force, so as to provide mutual support. Here are the origins of Napoleon's flying columns of the 1796 Italian campaign, and later on, his army corps of the Grande Armée. The third innovation identified by Chandler was Napoleon's utilization of a strong reserve. French and coalition numbers at campaign's start were roughly even, but Napoleon had only deployed half of his available force. Over 20,000 remained in the forts and garrisons on the French side of the lines. Likewise, Dom-Biddion led a large force that could provide reinforcements to Massena should the need have arisen. Put another way, with Massena's excellent tactical leadership, Napoleon had defeated 45,000 troops with 5,000. Without skipping a beat, Napoleon aimed to capitalize with an immediate follow-up offensive. The goal this time was to completely destroy or bypass the remaining forces of Sardinia-Piedmont and end the campaign with the French occupying the fertile plains of Mondovi, a region that would easily sustain the French army of Italy. Napoleon worked tirelessly to form his plan, exhausting Junot and Berliet in the process. The representatives again signed off on the plan and sent it up to Paris. Lazare Carnot, the great organizer of victory, was not completely sold. June 1794 would see renewed French offensives along the Rhine and into the Austrian Netherlands, efforts that were far more strategically important than a victory in Italy. Eventually, however, Carnot assented to the plan and the offensive commenced, all going well. But once the Alps had been fully taken, Carnot refused to let the French descend into the plains for fear that it would stretch the French thin elsewhere. Napoleon was cognizant of these worries and tried to allay Carnot's fears. Of course, Napoleon lacked the clout to converse with Carnot as an equal, so with permission, he wrote letters in Augustin Robespierre's name and made a case for an Italian offensive. If the armies which were on the Piemontese frontier should adopt an offensive principle, they would compel the Austrians to protect its Italian possessions. The principles of war are the same as those of a siege. Fire must be concentrated on a single point, and as soon as the breach is made, the equilibrium is broken, and the rest is nothing. The place is taken. It is the Austrians that must be crushed. That done, Spain and Italy will fall of their own accord. The attack must be concentrated, not dispersed. There was a wisdom in Napoleon's words far beyond his years. An attack upon an exposed underbelly in Italy would draw away Austrian forces from their Rhineland and lowland positions, thereby improving the chances of a French breakthrough. It's been well noted that this plan is the blueprint for Napoleon's 1796 campaign. Napoleon had rendered excellent service to France in only a few short months, more than justifying his promotion at such a young age. However, he had achieved these successes indirectly. At Toulon, de Gommier was credited with the win, and now in Piedmont, Dom-Biddion and Massena were the stars of the show. Even Napoleon's sound strategic advice had been communicated through intermediaries, namely Augustin. So despite Napoleon's success, he was not rewarded with the rapid advancement he desired. Instead, he was still reliant upon the goodwill of political benefactors. Augustin asked Napoleon for a favour in early July. With lines of trade and communication to Genoa secured, public safety desired stronger diplomatic ties. Senior diplomat Jean Tilly was sent along with a delegation that was meant to include Augustin Robespierre. However, things were heating up in Paris, so Augustin asked Napoleon to go in his place and act as a military attaché. Secretly, Napoleon also carried orders from another representative, calling for him to reconnoitre Genoa's defences should an invasion be deemed necessary. This sort of assignment was not to Napoleon's liking. At this early stage of his career, he had little in the way of diplomatic ambition. His eyes were firmly fixed on martial glory. He waited on every update from the army, hoping to get back to the front. These hopes were dashed in late July after a total political reversal up in Paris. The coup of 10 Thermidor had been months in the making. Maximilien Robespierre's increasing paranoia and dogged pursuit of his vision for a republic of virtue had alienated all but a few die-hard loyalists. Not only was the majority of the National Convention now opposed to Robespierre, but even the rump of his own Committee of Public Safety had turned against him. Otherwise opposed revolutionary factions were in agreement that Robespierre had to go. After months of trying to get Robespierre to step away peacefully, the plotters drew the long knives on the day of 9th Thermidor, July 26th. Their attempts to arrest the Robespierreists fell through. Robespierre and his allies held out in the Hôtel de Ville. One of these allies was Augustin, who the previous day had insisted that he be allowed to die alongside his brother. After an assault led personally by Paul Barras, the Robespierriste was seized. In all, 70 were fed to the guillotine on the afternoon of 10 Thermidor. This bad news reached Napoleon's ear at an otherwise joyous moment. On August 5th, Joseph Bonaparte was married to Marie Clary, the daughter of a wealthy Marseille merchant. The match went a long way to restoring Bonaparte finances, which were in the drain after the loss of their estates in Corsica. Of course, the fall of the Jacobins cast a shadow over proceedings. In a letter to Tilly, Napoleon dwelt on the death of his friend Augustin. But aware that such support might endanger the Bonapartes, he was quick to condemn. Quote, "Had Robespierre been my brother and aspired to tyranny, I'd have stabbed him myself." The next day, on August 6th, Napoleon was arrested on charges of treason for having supposedly sighted a gun battery overlooking Marseille way back in July. While in prison, Napoleon was afforded some comforts by a friendly prison warden. Napoleon also wrote to Salicetti, asking for his help. Little did he know, but it was on Salicetti's order that he had been arrested. The sly devil had sold out his friend and ally to ingratiate himself to the new regime. Even as Napoleon languished in jail, Salicetti scoured his papers, looking for some hint of double dealing. Eventually, Salicetti found what he was looking for: the secret orders Napoleon had obeyed in Genoa. His fate was sealed. It didn't take long for Napoleon to suspect Salicetti had sold him out, but he refrained from angry denunciation and instead resorted to very even-keeled appeals to his former comrades. One letter read, "Salicetti, you have relieved me from duty and ordered me under arrest. You have branded me without a sentence, or sentenced me without a hearing. Have I not, ever since the revolution began, constantly shown my devotion to just principles? Have I not taken my share in the struggles both against internal foes, and as a soldier, against foreign enemies? I have sacrificed everything for the Republic. I served at the siege of Toulon with some distinction, and with the army I earned my share of laurels at the capture of Saint-Ogier. Salicetti, you have known me 5 years. What have you seen in me that is suspect to the revolution?" As far as Napoleon was aware, he could be guillotined at any moment. At this early stage, the Thermidorians weren't cagey about killing their opponents, and Napoleon, a proud Jacobin, ally of the Robespierres, war hero and foreigner, was not the kind of guy they wanted to keep around to make trouble. In subsequent letters, including one written to the National Convention, Napoleon aimed to clear his name posthumously. Quote, "My heart is torn, and I feel that, with a cool head but a fiery heart, I cannot endure a life that is under the cloud of suspicion." Young Junot certainly feared the worst. He proposed to Napoleon a plan of escape. This Napoleon shot down on August 19th. "I appreciate all the friendliness of the offer you make me, my dear Junot. You know well the comradeship I feel for you. Men may be unjust to me, but my innocence remains. My conscience is easy. Therefore do nothing. You would only compromise me." Despite knowing that he may well be killed, Napoleon used his incarceration to pore over materials concerning earlier French Alpine campaigns, not something many would do on the eve of their execution. On the 20th, the Revolutionary Tribunal that had processed his case could find no compelling evidence of wrongdoing. Of course, all of Napoleon's conduct had been authorized and accounted for, even his secret mission. Charges were dropped, and Napoleon was let go after 2 weeks. Incredibly enough, it was Salicetti that had secured Napoleon's release. There was bad blood now, as might be expected, but Napoleon was not one to hold a grudge, and agreed to Salicetti's proposal that he get straight back to work. It soon became abundantly clear why Salicetti had been so eager to preserve the life of a talented young general. The Army of Italy's actions of the last few weeks had been embarrassing failures, and the offensive was stalled. It's debatable to what extent Napoleon's absence contributed to their failures. In all likelihood, the stall would have happened anyway. Either way, it's certainly the case that Napoleon was seen as the man to turn things around. He submitted a third plan for Carnot's consideration. This time, the intention was to blunt a brewing coalition counter-offensive and protect French gains on the Savona. As a significantly reinforced Austrian field army, under the command of Feldzeugmeister Oliver von Wallis, was massing along the river Bormida, the French advanced in 2 flying columns. Tactical command was in Massena's capable hands, and he thrashed the Austrians at the Battle of Digo. Casualties were light on both sides, but the Austrians, in a hasty retreat, left behind all 42 of their guns. The coalition offensive had been dashed before it even began. Napoleon was present for the Battle of Digo, though he had not been in command. The operation had been launched without the approval of public safety, now restaffed with a number of Thermidorians. Lazare Carnot remained and vetoed any further offensive operations, much to Napoleon's dismay. Dumberion obeyed these directives, and the French army of Italy retired to their positions in the Alps. Though Napoleon had acquitted himself well, and Dumberion praised him in dispatches back to Paris, the squandered opportunity left a bad taste in the young general's mouth. Dissatisfaction was only compounded by a period of inactivity. Napoleon did what he could to keep busy, organising his artillery and, most importantly, reconnoitring the Alpine passes at Saint Bernard. By March of 1795, Napoleon was transferred to a new army that was forming at Toulon. Public safety had accepted plans to reclaim Corsica from the British. A large force of some 16,000 men and the 15 still floating ships of the Mediterranean fleet put to sea on March 3rd. Of course, before reaching Corsican shores, the French blundered into the closed fist of the Royal Navy. Admiral William Hotham's squadron of 15 vessels was technically inferior to that of the French. His ships were smaller frigates, and not the heavy 60 and 70 gunners of the French force. But Hotham's squadron was nimble, his crews all sea salt veterans. In a series of actions from March 11th to the 14th, the French expedition was shredded. 2 ships were captured, the rest, badly damaged, retreated to Toulon. The failed Corsican expedition set back Napoleon's career by several months. Officers from the expedition and from the Army of Italy were reshuffled. Dumberion was recalled, and his replacement, Bartolomé Scherer, wanted nothing to do with Napoleon. By now, Napoleon's exploits were well known, but he was seen as overly aggressive and hungry for career advancement. There was also only so far the Thermidorians were willing to allow a former Jacobin to rise. So it was, in late March, that Napoleon was ordered to take a posting with the Army of the West. Second to Toul-les-Auches for service in a backwater region like the Vendée, Napoleon feared for his prospects. He delayed as long as he could, and then on May 8th darted up to Paris, taking with him his brother Louis. On May 25th, the Bonaparte brothers, in addition to Napoleon's staff, established themselves at the Hôtel de la Liberté. Soon thereafter, Napoleon trudged over to the Tuileries to make his case before the Ministry of War. The desires of this single general, 139th in seniority, were completely ignored. In fact, Napoleon ended up harming his own chances. After a series of damaging dialogues, he was humiliated with a demotion to command of an infantry brigade, as opposed to his beloved artillery. When that failed to compel Napoleon to take up his appointment, he was cashiered and placed on half pay. Presumably, the ministry expected that Napoleon would now feel forced to take up his post, if only for the money. But they underestimated just how much pain Napoleon was willing to endure to protect his pride. Louis was sent to Chalons to complete his military education, while Napoleon scraped out an existence in Paris, feigning illness to avoid service. These were a tough few months for Napoleon, relegated to a pauper's existence in Paris. His career stalled, possibly forever. In a letter to Joseph, Napoleon remarked, half-jokingly, quote, "I'll end up not stepping out of the way when a carriage approaches." But this gloomy episode did have a silver lining. Her name was Eugénie Désirée Clary. 16 years old to Napoleon's 24, Désirée was young and pretty, if a bit plain. She had come into Napoleon's world back in 1794. Wealthy Marseille merchant and industrialist François Clary had died in early 1794, leaving for his 2 daughters, Julie and Eugénie, a chimeric inheritance. A shed load of money, but the stain of counter-revolution, as François had supported the Federalists. Quite fortuitously for the Bonapartes, Joseph had caught the eye of Julie, the elder Clary daughter. Their match suited both families. The Clary were insulated from revolutionary reprisal, and the Bonapartes enjoyed a dowry of 400,000 francs, enough to set up Laetitia and the kids in some comfort at Antibes. Joseph and Julie were married on August 1st. 19-year-old Lucien had followed some time after, marrying Christine Boyer, an amicable 22-year-old woman who had enamored Lucien after a chance encounter in a Provençal tavern. It only remained for Napoleon to complete the trifecta by finding his own match. Désirée was the choice of both heart and mind. Sparks flew, and Napoleon began courting her as soon as they had met. While out on campaign, he spent every spare moment writing letters to her, confirming his love and devotion. They were engaged in April 1795. Of course, Napoleon's prospects took a tumble after his arrest. And it was only in September that ties were re-established in a flurry of correspondence. Quote, "The most imperative need of my soul," in Napoleon's own words. These missives fall far short of the nauseating love letters of fiction. In fact, the letters carried a familiar, stern edge. For as often as Napoleon professed his love, he also gave instructions to Désirée. For instance, he insisted she read a whole range of books, expand her repertoire of music and poetry, and generally just improve her intellect. There was something quite earnest in Napoleon's desire to intellectually stimulate Désirée. In an age of entrenched sexism, it was not considered normal for a woman to engage with history, arts, and science, except perhaps maybe as a passing distraction. Certainly, Napoleon wanted Desiree to be a cut above her peers, albeit for selfish reasons. Napoleon could not abide an idiot for a wife. Anything less, and he would lose interest. Desiree, for her part, seems to have responded happily enough. She enjoyed being pursued, and flirted right back in letters to her fiancé. Such letters often bore flirtatious jibes. In one letter, Desiree teased, quote, "Only the most sensible of women love the coldest of men." Napoleon took the bait, and replied, "There is no pleasure in which I do not wish to include you, no dream of which you do not furnish half. Be certain then that what you say is an iniquitous and ill-judged and unjust phrase, which you did not believe in writing. Your heart disavowed it, even as your hand wrote it." For a time, Napoleon even considered buying a long-abandoned estate out in Burgundy. Not only would this provide for his family, but more importantly, prove his earnest intentions towards Desiree. As it was, Desiree's mother was having second thoughts about marriage to yet another Bonaparte. And flighty Desiree was discovering that she was quite the eligible woman, suited to far better. Her attentions wandered. Napoleon rued this saddening state of affairs in a flurry of letters to Joseph. Distraught, he lashed out, declaiming women, the men who pursued them, and the whole business of love and marriage. For all his brilliance, this was a battle Napoleon could not win. Withdrawing from love's battlefield, every bit as dangerous as those in Italy, Napoleon found distraction in Paris's vivid social scene. A brief window in the relaxation of censorship post-Thermidor had unleashed a range of satirical plays and once-banned operas. With what little cash he could scrape together, Napoleon visited the Théâtre Français, the Feydeau, and the opera, particularly enjoying tragedies, which, he claimed, quote, "excite the soul and create heroes." During the day, Napoleon frequented Paris's dozens of salons and clubs, listening to and participating in lively debates. Furthering his own budding interest in astronomy, he also toured the observatory and the nearby Institut de France. Though Napoleon was a fixture of Paris's intellectual and social scene, he left a poor impression. Socialites fixated upon his awkwardness around women and a lack of bearing. Unable to afford proper clothing, Napoleon made do with what he had, which was often ill-fitting and unfashionable. One observer, socialite Laura de Abrantes, described Napoleon as, quote, "without gloves, with ill-made and ill-blackened boots, thin and with a sallow complexion." She nicknamed him Puss in Boots. Spurned from the fashionable social circles at a vulnerable time, Napoleon moped to Joseph and Junot, decrying the fashionistas and socialites as tacky reprobates. Ultimately, all of these social forays were distractions from the main event, which remained to be appointed back to the artillery and be given a decent posting. Sometime in June, Napoleon visited the estate of General Marmont as a friend of the family. Towards the end of the month, Austrian counterattacks had driven General Kellerman back from Napoleon's hard-won gains, losing some 15,000 killed and wounded. The progress of his two unabashed successors were undone in an instant. Through July, the Committee of Public Safety took these developments as indicators that the war in Italy was all but lost. There was talk of abandoning the offensive altogether, merely bottling up the enemy with a strong Alpine defence. But the experience of politically ascendant Paul Barras and Louis Freron, as well as Carnot's own insight, convinced the National Convention to endorse a renewed offensive. The task of drafting this fourth plan of attack was to be undertaken by the Topographic Bureau. Established by Carnot in 1792, the Bureau had been intended as a kind of brains trust for public safety, basically a group of senior officers who could offer sound military advice at a moment's notice. Once the crises of 92 and 93 had abated, this temporary bureau was formalised and given over to Carnot's favourite general, Henri Clark. Their purview was then extended from merely offering advice to outright war planning. Put another way, the Topographic Bureau was the first general staff in military history, making plans that politicians could then accept, deny, or modify. The Bureau had an entire staff dedicated to the Italian front, and it was decided that Napoleon, who had actually been successful on that front, would make a fine addition. But initially, Napoleon was very standoffish and rebuffed the Bureau's attempts to court him. In the first 2 weeks of August, he still sought a frontline posting with the artillery. And since the French weren't putting out, Napoleon gave serious consideration to serve the Ottoman Sultan as a general for hire. No doubt imagining the possibility of his own Anatolian exploits to stand alongside those of Alexander. According to Lucien, Napoleon even considered serving the East India Company. The Russians were likewise interested. Letizia nixed these ideas pretty quickly, prompting Napoleon to redouble his efforts. The Ministry of War was having none of that and demanded he present himself along with proof of incapacitating illness. His bluff called, Napoleon was narrowly saved by the timely intercession of the Topographic Bureau. On August 20th, 1 year after leaving the Antibes jail cell, he begrudgingly accepted their offer. It was to prove one of the most important decisions of Napoleon's career. Installed at the Bureau's offices in the Tuileries, Napoleon worked part-time, 4-hour shifts, one in the afternoon and one in the early morning. His job was to work through the correspondence and reports from the front and offer recommendations and instructions to on-the-ground officers. To aid in these efforts were, of course, his own personal staff of Junot and Berlier. Marmont was retasked, sent over to the Army of the Rhine for the siege of Mainz. In terms of seniority, Napoleon was not high up, but this was a prime learning experience, and he learnt a great deal from working with Generals Lausset and Houdon, as well as the pedigreed César Gabriel Berthier, brother of the far more famous Louis-Alexandre Berthier, who we will come to know well. Bolstered by the experience of his fellow generals, and with the aid of a fine staff, Napoleon furnished public safety with a fourth offensive plan. In his own words, "In the present situation, the King of Sardinia-Piedmont most certainly desires peace. Therefore, we must carry the war to his country and maneuver the Austrians into such a position that we can eventually threaten their southern flank. The army of Italy must drive the enemy from the heights of Loano, threaten Piedmont, conquer Lombardy, penetrate into the Tyrol, and effect its junction with the advancing army of the Rhine." As per his recommendations, thousands of reinforcements were called up and dispatched to General Scherer. The army of Italy still suffered from severe shortages of even basic supplies, and there was only so much Napoleon could fix from 1,000 kilometers away. By September, Scherer had around 33,000 effectives to Devin's 42,000. It was, however, on the eve of a new offensive that Napoleon's political fortunes took another ill-timed tumble. Louis Freron was on the verge of being indicted by the National Convention. Barras was similarly afflicted. Out of favour, Napoleon was summarily sacked on September 15th for his refusal to take the post in the Vendée. Thus, Napoleon's plan went into effect without his further input. Worse still, it was delayed for as long as a resource-hungry army of the Rhine desperately held their position in Germany. But the delay ended up inadvertently aiding the French. Down in Italy, the coalition was suffering from a severe lack of coordination at the command level. Disagreements over their exact course of action had squandered the coalition victory in July and given the French ample opportunity to recover. Devins resigned in protest, handing the reins off to Vallas just as Scherer attacked. On November 23rd, the army of Italy was divided into 3 separate divisions. Massena, who had stuck around in Italy, led one of these divisions over the mountains and around the Austrian lines. The 2nd division, led by Pierre Augereau, flanked around as well. At the subsequent Battle of Loano on November 25th, the Austrians and Piedmontese were routed. However, the French pursuit was ineffective, as Scherer, perhaps sensibly, chose to secure his rear lines. Of course, having been fired, Napoleon was ill-informed of happenings in Italy. His primary concern now was to secure the Bonaparte family's position as best he could. Joseph's prospects seemed the most secure, and Napoleon spent much of August trying to set his brother up with a gig in the convention, or even just the Paris municipal government. By September, Joseph was reduced to considering appointments in provincial backwaters, something Napoleon strenuously denied. Amidst these personal worries, he continued to write. Inspired by Goethe's bestseller, The Sorrows of Youth, Napoleon penned his own romance novella, professing his unrequited love for Désirée. Clisson et Eugénie was all but autobiographical, with the character of Clisson, a name borrowed from one of Napoleon's friends, being a self-insert. A love-struck Clisson meets a young, virginal Eugénie at a spa, and the rest of the book follows their idyllic life together. By the end, Clisson sacrifices himself in battle, leaving Eugénie a widow. While a self-indulgent and uninteresting experiment, Clisson et Eugénie is at least informative. It's certainly interesting to note that Clisson, Napoleon, lived the quiet life of a country gentleman, was generous to the poor, and ultimately a martyr for France. This was quite a sea change for Napoleon, who was evidently deep in love, both with a woman and his adoptive homeland. Sadly, in late 1795, Napoleon was spurned by both France and Désirée, seemingly reeling from one dead end to the next. There seemed to be no way out of this rut, until, through the vagaries of fortune, Napoleon's prospects would be completely revived. The origins of this revival stretch back to earlier in the year, as the National Convention formally adopted a new constitution for France. The Constitution of Year 3 was intended to secure the gains of the Thermidorians by institutionalizing power in their hands. Of course, the constitution had all of the revolutionary bells and whistles, and was couched in revolutionary language. France would stay a republic, there would be elections, albeit reserved for tax-paying males, and all of the existing institutions would remain in place. But despite the nice packaging, the contents would remain the same. Power vested in the butter fingers of a politically ascendant middle class. For our purposes, the most significant change was that the National Convention would be superseded by a bicameral system of 2 legislative houses, the Council of 500 for the lower house, and the Council of Ancients as an upper house, there to serve as a conservative backstop. A small 5-man directory would hold executive powers. All of this meant that elections were in order. In the lead-up, the political situation in Paris deteriorated rapidly. Already, the convention had been brought to their knees by numerous journées, basically coordinated uprisings, launched by the pissed-off Parisian sections after reactionary Thermidorian policy had annihilated the social and economic gains of the revolution. In late September, another journée was looming. Ominously, Napoleon recorded in his diary, quote, "Everything here is quiet for the moment, but it may be that a storm is brewing." The constitution had been accepted by the convention on August 19th, but it still required a referendum to be ratified nationally. Returns demonstrated that support for the Thermidorians was now puddle deep. Even once supportive royalist and conservative groups were fed up. Everybody's specific hang-up was over the issue of the renewal. The convention intended to simply transition into power without new elections, meaning that the 750 seats among the 2 new councils would be filled by the current crop of despised delegates. Though the constitution was accepted, the renewal was only accepted by some creative accounting from the convention. Nobody was fooled by this obvious deception, and on September 7th, 47 of the 48 sections of Paris formed a committee to organise resistance. Over the next few weeks, tensions rose, reaching a head on September 2nd, 11 Vendémiaire. The left-leaning sections of Paris's north and east had been thrashed after their most recent failed journée, and lacking effective leadership, none were willing to risk further damage combating the renewal. On the other hand, the conservative Le Peltier section was willing to do battle. This was an embittered royalist section from the south. Meeting in the Théâtre Français that night, they decided to go it alone. The storm had arrived. However, the Le Peltier had only a few thousand armed supporters to their name, and even buoyed by the jaded Jeunesse Dorée, a royalist militia, this was hardly an overwhelming force. Nonetheless, the National Convention had taken the threat extremely seriously. Over the last few months, the military build-up in Paris had seen the National Guard reinforced by the regular army. Chasseurs patrolled the streets, guards garrisoned civic buildings, the heart of government at the Tuileries was itself a heavily defended fortress. Late in the night of October 4th, General Jean-François Menou, sympathetic to the royalists, had been dispatched with a sizable force to crush the Le Peltier. He advanced into the rebellious section, but found the streets empty, the buildings abandoned. Spooked, and with his heart not really in the fight, Menou negotiated his own retreat. This was a debacle that allowed the Le Peltier to regroup. A defected general named Denikin barreled headlong toward the Tuileries. Days prior, the National Convention had formed a small emergency committee to oversee their defence. Despite their preparations, they were caught off guard by the sudden onset of armed attackers. With Menou arrested, the emergency committee now had to find a senior officer to lead the defence. Problem was, they had so few officers that were on hand, and even those that were could not be relied upon to fire on civilians if push came to shove. Having proven decisive for the Thermidorian coup, and acting as the current convention president, Paul Barras was offered the gig. He accepted, and set about fortifying the Tuileries and the nearby church of Saint-Roch. The long Rue Saint-Honoré that passed right by the Tuileries complex was blockaded with multiple barricades. The bridges over the Seine were similarly defended. Sightlines along the Place de la Concorde were cleared. Joachim Murat, major of the 21st Regiment of Hussars, patrolled the streets. Should the unthinkable happen, and the Tuileries fall, he was expected to cover the retreat and escort the convention delegates to safety. Barras surveyed these defences and correctly surmised that it was too little, too late. Outnumbered and with limited firepower, the odds were not in his favour. He also questioned whether the National Guard would fire on the mobs. Cannons might even the odds, but Barras had none. They sat in storage 2 miles away at the Champ de Sablon. It was at this critical moment when a young artillery officer approached Barras and offered his services. Napoleon had been at the theatre the night before when he caught word of the imminent journée. As Menou was on the march, Napoleon was working his way toward the Tuileries, arriving late in the night, just as Barras was despairing as to their chances. In Napoleon's own account, he claimed, "I found several deputies in a state of great alarm, among others Combeferres. They expected to be attacked the next day, and didn't know what to do. My reply was, 'Give me a cannon.'" The name Napoleon was well known to several leading delegates, including Jean-Baptiste Tallien, Carnot, Freron, and of course Barras, who were all well aware of Napoleon's exploits. Even the aforementioned Régis Combeferres knew this young officer, if only for the fact that he'd signed off on Napoleon's firing. Confident and capable, Napoleon was immediately field commissioned as a General de Division. However, Napoleon only agreed to serve on one condition: he got to choose where the guns were positioned. Barras agreed. If this cocky kid could perform a miracle and snag the guns from the Sablon, then why not let him position them? Quick to the mark, Napoleon ordered Major Murat to take a detachment of hussars and secure the Sablon guns. Anyone who interfered was to be considered hostile. By around 6 AM, Murat had returned, guns in tow. Over the next 3 hours, Napoleon positioned the guns. 2 on the Rue Saint-Nicaise, and another 2 sighted down the Rue Saint-Honoré, alongside the Place Vendôme. Along the Pont Royal, he placed 2 more to lock down the bridge. Barras' headquarters at the Saint-Roch were protected by the last 2 cannon, which Napoleon sighted in such a way as to provide overlapping fields of fire into the plaza outside the church. There hadn't been any time to properly fortify the gun positions, so Napoleon instead had infantry stand by to defend them. Between reloads, musket fire would cover the gunners. Napoleon was in his element, sighting each gun personally, racing around on his horse, preparing the defences. Denikin had delayed his attack, amassing followers all the while. He had something like 20 to 30,000 at his disposal. With such crushing numbers, he could probably have gone in a few hours earlier, but Denikin was convinced that defection and demoralization would do the fighting for him. At 10 AM, he sent forth women and children to demoralize the already wavering National Guard. Seeing his men falter throughout the day, in the late afternoon, Barras emerged from the Saint-Roch and in his booming voice ordered the mobs to disperse or be fired upon. Undeterred, the mob advanced. Shots rang out from the rooftops, either Barras' own skirmishers or trigger-happy insurrectionaries. No matter who it was, the first shots had been fired and the bloodshed commenced. Barras delivered the order to fire. The infantry let loose, cutting through the ranks of the attackers. The fire was nasty but insufficient, and the insurrectionaries, knowing the Saint-Honoré's medieval alleys all too well, outflanked the defenders. The situation was critical just as the long guns began to roar. At Napoleon's order, all the cannon had been loaded with grape shot, also known as canister shot. Large canvas tubes of several hundred musket balls, or even just jagged pieces of metal, could fire a shotgun-like blast out to ranges of several hundred yards. This concentrated burst of shrapnel could quite literally eviscerate a person, as in their 1 second reduced to giblets the next. For all the upheaval in revolutionary Paris, this terrifying weapon had not once been deployed. Napoleon would have the ignominious honour of being the first to deploy canister shot in the city, and against civilians no less. This was his infamous whiff of grape shot. Dead and dying littered the Rue Saint-Honoré. More grape shot rippled down the Pont Royal from cannons positioned on the Quai Voltaire. Denikin's main effort was concentrated down the bridges. A bad idea as it turned out, because the already incredibly destructive fire of the cannons was amplified when focused down the narrow confines of a featureless bridge. Over the next few hours, hundreds of the attackers were killed in their droves. The survivors lost heart, retreating deep into the sections. Murat, held in reserve, was let loose, pursuing the insurrectionaries all throughout the city, cutting down dozens more. It was quite the twist of fate that Napoleon, having twice before witnessed assaults upon the Tuileries, would himself, a few years later, defend the Tuileries from a mob. What exactly took place on the bloody day that was 13 Vendémiaire provided a great deal of fodder for anti-Napoleon propagandists. Indeed, this event was the archetype of most anti-Napoleon propaganda, especially that published by London-based papers, which depicted Napoleon as a bloodthirsty, continental brute. There's no question that Napoleon killed a lot of people on 13 Vendémiaire. At one stage, he advanced his cannon to within about 50 metres of the insurrectionaries, to terrible effect. By comparison, only a handful of his own men were killed, so the slaughter would appear disproportionate. And bearing in mind that Napoleon was helping to put down a revolt, and not, as per his self-professed revolutionary principles, joining in, the whole whiff of grapeshot affair does at least on the surface seem to paint Napoleon as something of a hypocrite. But such assessments aren't quite fair. This is the definitive assertion of Napoleon as the defender of order. The royalist insurrection threatened a convention Napoleon would be quick to admit he'd been hard done by. But they were still a legitimate government, and at least as far as people understood things at the time, still a revolutionary government. In later years, Napoleon's heart would harden. He somewhat embraced his reputation as the bringer of order. For instance, he remarked, quote, "Good and upstanding people must be persuaded by gentle means. Rabble are only moved by terror." However, in the immediate aftermath, Napoleon was far from sanguine. A few hours after the fighting ended, Napoleon wrote to Joseph, "At last, it's all over, and first thought is to send you the news." The royalists were growing bolder by the day. The convention had ordered the section Lepeletier to be disarmed, but the section resisted. Menu was immediately relieved of duty. The emergency committee selected Barrard to command the defence, and I as second in command. We made our arrangements. The enemy attacked us. We killed a great many. We've disarmed the sections. Good fortune is with me. Send my love to Eugenie and Julie. This black mark on Napoleon's career doesn't withstand much scrutiny, though it does, nonetheless, remain a lamentable loss of life. At the time, Napoleon did not relish his role, but he did expect to be rewarded. And so he would be. Time and time again he'd proven to be extremely capable and steadfastly loyal. From Ajaccio to Toulon, from Genoa to Dago, whether at a desk pen in hand, or as now, over the gun sights at Vendémiaire, Napoleon had proven his mettle. And yet, his political fortunes had failed to reflect an otherwise stellar record. That was until now. The convention was weak and frail. They needed all the help they could get. The services of General de Division Napoleon Bonaparte was something France required to weather the storm.